Hello, wrestling friends. I'm Matt Koon, which means you're listening to the Gentleman Villain podcast, but we don't have Mr. Regal here today. Instead, we have a special guest. He is an Emmy award-winning broadcaster. He's the co-host of the Matt Hardy pod, The Extreme Life of Matt Hardy, as well as the co-host of Strictly Business with Eric Bischoff. And also, he has a Patreon you might want to check out, Wrestling According to Alba. And you can check that out, too. But let's introduce him to you. Ladies and gentlemen, Jon Alba's here. Hello, Jon. How you doing?
What a downgrade from the gentleman villain himself, huh?
Well, I feel the same way. Like, you talk to Bischoff and you talk to Matt Hardy all the time, then you're like, Matt Koon. Oh, well, that sounds like fun.
Nah, man, this is fun. I appreciate the invitation to be here to chat all things William Regal. It was certainly a notable week in the life of William Regal, and I know that this is going to be a pretty newsworthy podcast.
And a notable day, because we're recording this after Dynamite. So unless something predictable happens, the show will come out on time on Thursday. But, Jon, today we're going to talk about a bunch of things. We're going to kind of briefly, go over William Regal's career in AEW. And then we're going to talk about what happened today. There's a press conference with more news about Mr. Regal. And there was a Dynamite segment and some talking about Mr. Regal. And we're going to talk about the future of the Gentleman Villain podcast as well. But we're going to go ahead and get started with a little history of Mr. Regal in AEW. How does that sound to you?
That sounds great, because I was there on day one.
So before day one, Mr. Regal got let go, released from the WWE on January 5th, 2022. It ended a 22-year tenure with the company, and that was a surprising one for me. Was it surprising for you as well?
It was surprising in the sense that you never thought something like that was going to happen, right? You didn't envision something like that going down, but I think what we were seeing in WWE at the time was this massive overhaul of employees at the top of the ladder, this systemic change that was going on as Paul Levesque and Stephanie McMahon were starting to lose power a little bit. Vince McMahon was changing up the top of the hierarchy there. So with that happening, they were kind of restructuring developmental and producers and backstage and how all of that looked. And as a result, figureheads like William Regal and some others that I don't want to go into names at this moment in time, but others who almost lost their jobs were let go or came close to losing their gigs. And I think that was just a true writing on the wall situation that, okay, we're approaching new territory in WWE. And man, Matt, you mentioned January 5th. It just seems like an eternity ago, given how much things have changed in the year since. 2022,
the most newsworthy year in the history of professional wrestling, one might, because this is a huge story. This is a huge story. And of course, Mr. Regal would absolutely hate this episode because we're talking about stuff that he won't talk about. And we're talking about stuff in a way he never would, talking about rumors and stuff like that. And, it was very apparent to me, not something I'd say to him because he'd Regal stretch me through the screen, but very apparent to me, he's a Triple H guy. Like, in hosting this show, I came to learn, that they broke in really together. Like, I knew they were there at the same time, but I didn't realize the connection they had right away. They started writing together, started working together, and him being let go, to us fans at least, was an indication that Triple H isn't running this. Is that how you took it as well?
Very much so. And I think that was the impression that a lot of people had internally and externally at the time. So when you change up things so radically in the way they do, you get these jaw-dropping releases. Keep in mind, Regal was not the only one. Samoa Joe was someone that I think was being positioned to be a major player in developmental in WWE. There were some other coaches involved too. And as a result, you get these shocking releases that in some alternate timeline where Vince McMahon doesn't step down, we're looking at something entirely different. But as we know, events unfolded, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but events unfolded that completely disrupted the space-time continuum in the pro wrestling world.
Well, I heard a little thing or two from my friend Conrad at the time, and it was apparent to me that he was going to at least start a podcast. We were very excited about the idea of Mr. Regal starting a podcast. We didn't know what it would be. We kind of assumed First of all, I assumed he would host it, and second of all, I assumed that it would be, he would tell the stories, And Mr. Regal let me know very shortly, episode 1, that's not what we're doing here, and that goes to show his uniqueness in the wrestling industry, and that uniqueness was on display. And you said you were there. Just a couple months later in March, when he makes his debut for All Elite Wrestling, we had this, this interesting angle going on where Moxley and Danielson are kind of getting along, but kind of beefing a little bit. And all of a sudden, Mr. Regal makes his appearance, slaps them both in the face, pretty much forms the Blackpool Combat Club on the spot. What was it like in the building?
Massive ovation. And I don't know if you remember, but he almost kind of just snuck in when he came down the entranceway, and people would turn their heads and there wasn't fanfare, or there wasn't pomp and circumstances, I should say. He just kind of waltzed down, and everyone's like, oh my goodness, there he is. And it was one of those things where kind of hell froze over, right? This was a guy that people thought would be a WWE lifer, and here he was in an AEW ring with two guys that everyone instantaneously knew he had a connection to. And you knew deep down that there were definitely roots for a great story. And afterwards, in the post-show press conference, it was immediate how much respect Tony Khan had for William Regal. He out of the gate referred to him as Lord Regal, which just pops me so much because Tony Khan, the wrestling nerd that he is, knows him as Lord Regal, and that's how he is referring to him formally. And he was so grateful that Regal was going to give AEW a shot and bring expertise. And I don't think anyone at that time, Matt, realized just how prevalent of an on-air character he was about to become.
Yeah, it was an interesting idea. Like, you took pretty much all the good guys in AEW and put them on one side, put them all together. Like, some of the biggest names, Moxley, huge name. Danielson, huge name. Claudio comes in, huge name. And then they start this thing that they never really got to finish, I think. This idea that the Blackpool Combat Club was designed to help get these younger wrestlers, these newer wrestlers, the Wheeler Yutas, the Daniel Garcias, the Lee Moriartys, was designed to elevate them up to that level. But I also think that perhaps, without getting too deep in the weeds here, it was reflective of what was going on behind the scenes as well. We talk a lot about, on the show, Mr. Regal says, I'm there at 10 o'clock every morning at the ring with Bryan Danielson. And I got the impression that sometimes there wasn't as many wrestlers there as maybe he thought they should be. And it's, in one sense, it's crazy to think that. Like, William Regal is here. He's the guy who is the gatekeeper, literally, for how to get WWE. And also, he's William Regal, this amazing wrestler. But on the other hand, you have guys that are already stars. There's no, in their mind at least, there's no carrot to dangle. They're not job scared like they're in WWE. They're not looking to be promoted like they're in NXT. So I think the Blackpool Combat Club and its kind of, inability to follow through with this idea long-term of getting a few wrestlers to that level that they did with Wheeler was probably indicative of what's going on behind the scenes. Is that kind of what you heard too?
I think, and I mean, Brian Pillman Jr. pretty much confirmed as much on social media this past week that there was some of that going on. And maybe it comes down to, what is his role? Is he an on-camera guy? Is he a coach? Is he a producer? Where does that stand? And maybe some people had that mentality. I don't know. But I do think that ultimately that line has to be drawn where if people want to learn from it, they're going to go out of their way to do so. And if they don't want to, well, then that's something they're going to be missing out on. I was excited you asked me to be a part of this because I've had a William Regal story that I told on the Extreme Life of Matt Hardy that I wanted to share with you on here regarding William Regal coaching. I got lunch one day with an NXT talent, no longer with NXT, but he and I were talking, and he loved Regal, loved working with William Regal in NXT. But he said, this man loves pro wrestling so much that when he gets so entranced with discussing the nuances of it, he almost forgets what's around him. And in this particular case, this wrestler went up to William one day and was asking, hey, I've got this wrist lock on someone. I just want to know how I can tighten it up and make it look more
Oh, no.
more fluid and more deformed.
And he's asking obviously the right guy.
Sure, right, as you've covered ad nauseum on this podcast. The issue was he had a health screening to go to about 50 minutes later, and he's like, I'll just ask him this quick question, I'll go about my way. William Regal then went into telling the entire history of this particular lock to him and demonstrating it in a multitude of ways that he actually missed his health screening as a result. But he's like, listen, that's whatever. I got a slap on the wrist, no pun intended for it. He's like,
right.
To get a chance to just pick that brain and understand that history, it was something that I'm never going to forget. So I think that speaks to the type of teacher that he is, Matt.
He reminded me a bit of myself. That's what I do, is I teach. And he was always in teacher mode, always willing to teach, always willing to learn. And, with the show, it was a lot like that. If you can imagine that lack of awareness that this guy that you're talking about has a health screening, so he just, on this show, he just had a microphone in front of him. So there's nothing stopping him. And I found it awesome personally, because he always could bring it back around. But again, like he would go on a tangent of something, and then he would bring it back around to the point, and he was pretty good at that. But again, we talked about wrist locks. I know you're supposed to hold your thumbs parallel. I do know that. And, we talked about pins a lot too, and that's an example of something that I'll never forget, because I was watching wrestling tonight. We were watching Dynamite, and man, some of those pins, I'm just like, are you trying to win a match, man? Are you trying to, so the education never stopped. On screen, they did this great video, and I don't think we should forget about the great video they made with Giancarlo about the Blackpool Combat Club, where Regal takes his thumb across his cheek, and this is after they bled out Yuta, and it was a really compelling piece of work. Regal did it in one take. Giancarlo told me that, and Regal just said, I just do things in one take. Do you remember that promo, and what did you think of it?
I think it is reflective of William Regal's inherent ability to have pro wrestling, all the elements of pro wrestling, including performance, come naturally to him. You talk about living the gimmick, right? I feel like few people in wrestling history have lived the gimmick quite like the villain William Regal. Everything is natural to him, and that's just from reps and reps and reps and reps, and also having that psychological understanding of the art side of professional wrestling. When you treat an art form with so much respect, you know this about music, when you treat an art form with so much respect that it becomes that personal to you, sometimes that passion can be confused for arrogance. But I think it's that passion that brings out the greatest performers. And in that promo specifically that you're referring to with William Regal, I think there's few better examples of that than an instance like that.
Yeah, we talk about people like Dax Harwood, who is just so passionate about the business that he gets himself in trouble quite often. And Mr. Regal, who, you say living the gimmick, that's something I never say in front of him, either gimmick or living the gimmick. But it's apparent to me it's not that. It's just who he is. There's very little crossover between William Regal, the person on TV, and Darren Matthews. That's why I always refer to him as Mr. Regal. And I'll tell you something on the show right now. If you notice every single tweet I do, every single show we did, I never called him Darren. I never called him William. I never called him Steven. I always called him Mr. Regal, because he told me very early on that as a young man, as a kid in school, he felt when people called him Regal, it was very condescending. He felt it spoke to his class, like it's much more of a caste system there in England. So if a teacher goes Regal, it was very, condescending and just.
I certainly didn't mean it in that way, just in case he's listening. I just want to make that clear.
Right. But it's just kind of a funny thing, because I never felt comfortable calling him anything else. And then it became kind of like a cool thing where I'm like, I'm just going to call him Mr. Regal from now on. And it works for me, even though he's only a couple years older than me. With the Blackpool Combat Club, there was a little stop and start there. There's some stuff plot line wise, narrative wise, that didn't make a whole bunch of sense to me. I remember FTR winning at the Ring of Honor pay-per-view, and the Blackpool Combat Club coming out to stare him down. And that's something that never got followed up on. It was a good closing moment. And I think there was a bit of that. And then we run into, that piece of crap, Maxwell Jacob Friedman. And that beginning of that storyline, or whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, because some of it was real. A lot of it was real. What we did on the show was real. Especially at the very beginning, was some of the most compelling television, not just in 2022, but of the last few years. That first promo they did in the ring, where Maxwell Jacob Friedman talks about his email he got. Man, that rung true as crazy, did it not?
It did, and what's remarkable about all that is that was all a pivot. This was supposed to be a CM Punk MJF story that was being told. And instead, they pivoted to tell this story with William Regal and the Blackpool Combat Club, which lays potential opponents down the line for MJF should he have won the championship, which, as we know, he ultimately did. And one of the things that I do appreciate greatly in a lot of AEW storytelling is that there are callbacks, and fans who pay attention, generally speaking, are rewarded for paying attention. I think that's a credit to the performers that are involved who pick up on those small details and make sure that they are hit upon. And there really are a lot of parallels between MJF and William Regal at the end of the day. And the whole idea, Matt, I just love so much. They reinforce the concept that MJF is the devil. Sympathy for the devil. You've got him referring to himself as the devil himself. William Regal makes a deal with the devil, and he pays for making that deal. I think that's just so poetic, and those are the things you love about pro wrestling storytelling.
When done right, and rarely done right, it works out. And we'll talk about that in a second, about how the off-screen stuff affected the on-screen stuff, because the way that it kind of circled around and the timing of everything, and, why not just kind of crossing that right now, and listening to Tony Khan's, we'll get into more of Tony Khan's press conference, but listening today, a lot was kind of put on the CM Punk injury. Like, well, the firm earlier this week, the manager of the firm was talking about how CM Punk, him being out, affected them. Of course, CM Punk being out affected what happened with MJF, How much of a factor do you think that was in, would there be a Mr. Regal MJF thing if CM Punk didn't, let's just leave Brawl out of it, if CM Punk didn't get hurt?
No, I don't think there would have been, regardless of whether it was Brawl out or whether it was the injury. I don't think we would have seen MJF and Regal in that sense, but also Regal had not, this is per Tony Khan himself on this press conference this week, Regal himself had not requested his release from AEW as of All Out. So none of that had been in the underlying cards. And you might have said to yourself, watching it on TV, well, that kind of came out of nowhere. That kind of came together really quickly. It did, because that's what real life dictated. And they managed to make a pivot where I think for all intents and purposes, they told a pretty effective story in a short period of time.
I think they did. And there was a lot of old school do the honors on the way out kind of situation,
Very much so.
As we go through this timeline, which is almost done, by the way, they had as you said, they had the match where, with Jon Moxley and MJF, where Regal showed his true colors and hit Jon Moxley with the brass knuckles, making MJF win. At the time, it made sense, never trust the devil. Oh, the devil's Regal, okay? But it wasn't, because shortly thereafter, MJF turns on Regal. Now, did that, you said it was satisfying to you. To me, it seemed a little like, I don't know. I'm not sure it's a cohesive story in that sense, but I could be wrong. Maybe you can convince me otherwise.
What I think made you maybe feel that way is that it happened so quickly. Had that burnt a little more, and had we seen that play out over a few more weeks, maybe a month, maybe even 2 months, then I think you'd be saying, oh man, MJF just used this guy and he got his comeuppance and he brought the whole email story full circle. I think you'd probably have more leverage in saying that. So I understand the hesitance in that. But you could also look at it from the standpoint, Matt, that, well, at the end of the day, Max got what he wanted and he cut the bait. He didn't need anything else after that. He got exactly what he wanted. He wanted the championship. He utilized William Regal in that way, and then he was able to turn everything on itself and reference the email. I love good full circle storytelling. They were able to do that. So I don't really have a problem with the execution of it, other than maybe it was a little fast, but we also know in hindsight why it was so fast now.
Well, I'll tell you what's not going to be fast, Jon Alba, is me saying this. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. This holiday season, do something for a special person in your life. You. Give yourself a gift to raise your spirits, and not just for the day. The holidays, as we know, can be a really tough time between managing family dynamics, racing from thing to thing, and braving the cold and dark weather. It's normal to feel down. I've talked a little bit about how I have some seasonal depression. Also, holidays in the past have been very tough for me because I'm someone without a family, without my son, if you don't count my son, and someone who has needed help in the past. And what has helped me is having someone to talk to about how I'm feeling, because I am one of those guys who looks like I'm talking a lot, but I don't really say a bunch because I don't really talk about how I'm feeling. But having someone I can talk to about that is truly a gift. And getting in therapy was such a gift for me. It gave me a chance to kind of talk things through. Jon, I know you've had your own situations. How beneficial has therapy been to you or someone in your life?
Oh, no, incredibly. And I'm always willing to talk about that stuff on The Extreme Life of Matt Hardy. BetterHelp was a partner with us for a long time, and I took advantage of their services, and they were outstanding. They did an excellent job at providing me a resource that I could count on, and including some of our listeners as well. And as part of the Podcast Heat family, we're all very grateful that they've been able to extend that help towards so many people. It's one of those things, Matt, where once you do it, you realize why you did it.
Yeah, and it's one of these things, it's one of the hardest things to pull the Band-Aid off is to get started on therapy, because I remember once I was loading a 4x8 piece of plywood in the back of my truck, and somebody came up to me and goes, "Hey, you need help?" And I go, "No, I got it." And as the person walked away, I'm like, what kind of idiot am I? I'm about to be taken away by the wind like a kite. And I'm like, "Hey, bro, no, I'm good." And I think that's just part of the makeup of a lot of people. And the best thing you can do is ask for help. And I know on The Extreme Life of Matt Hardy, there's a huge mental health component. You talk about that a lot. And the awareness of mental health and the awareness of the help that people can get and people can need has come a long way. And by the way, the world's largest therapy service is BetterHelp. As the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. It really is. It's if you don't think it's affordable, check it out. Check it out, and then do the balance of how much value will it add to your life, because some things are worth the price at any cost. All you gotta do is fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. If things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It could not be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic, no endless searching for the right therapist. Learn more and save 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/gentleman. That's BetterHelp, H-E-L-P.com/gentleman. Let me do that again. That's not right at all. It's BetterHelp, HELP.com/gentleman. I'm like Ron Burgundy. I literally read H dash. Jon, see, that's the first me and you. You are an Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, and you also, by the way, offer help to people like me who have no idea what we're doing. People have told me since I was 10, they said, "Hey, you have a great voice for radio."
You do.
And I was like, "Oh, cool." And the first time I met Conrad's like, "You should do podcasting just because the voice." But I never did anything before. As a matter of fact, I had a significant stutter until I was about 21 years old, where I couldn't really talk. I've made up for lost time. Talk about your mentoring program for people who are trying to become better podcasters, better broadcast journalists, better sportscasters, better media people.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about this real quick. You see, there's a A good old Emmy back there. It's called the Alba Media School, albamediaschool.com. It's one-on-one consultations with you and I believe that it is a great, affordable way to, whether it's open that door to potentially starting a path in content creation or editorial work, or maybe refine your skill set a little bit. I've worked with journalists on television. I've worked with writers. I've worked with content creators, podcasters. I've kind of done it all in my career so far. I've been on national television, on regional television, on local television. I've written. So I feel like my skill set's very well rounded for getting rid of bad habits. And we all have bad habits and things that we do. I have bad habits on a daily, quite frankly. And sometimes you just need to have someone point them out to you and come up with strategies with how to get through them. I had an agent for many years and I liked my agent, but there were a lot of times that I just felt like I was paying my agent so much money for coaching that I could have gone elsewhere for cheaper. And that's where the Alba Media School comes in. Extremely affordable for anybody who wants to just give it a shot. Even if you have no experience whatsoever in media work or editorial work and you just want to figure out where to start, I feel like I can help you. And if you are experienced, I feel like I can help maintain your skill set and round it off and get rid of some of those bad habits. So you can head to albamediaschool.com and book your consultation today.
I would definitely recommend it. You know, what you can do is you can do that, or you can just suck like I did for a long time. And I know what you're thinking, or you're thinking, hey, Matt, you didn't do it. But what I had is I had access to perhaps the greatest wrestling podcaster in the history of wrestling podcasts. And we've been close, close enough for me to talk to for a long time. So he would always give me feedback. He would always, I would always ask questions. He would be honest with me. He helped me get better at this. And that's what Jon Alba is offering for you. And Conrad Thompson don't have no Emmy. That's all I'm saying. So Jon Alba, he just winked, folks. Ladies, he is single, by the way.
All right. Now we're really advertising here.
And let's get back to it. So we covered kind of the on-screen stuff, but let's finish off the on-screen stuff. Today, just minutes ago on Dynamite, there was a promo, a pre-recorded promo. Obviously pre-recorded because he's there and he's not in a stretcher. He's not in an ambulance. And I know he's not there. I know he's not anywhere near there. So it was premeditated, preordained. What it was is Mr. Regal said, just in case something happens to me, I have Tony Schiavone, who I trust here. I have John Carlo, again, doing the camera. In case anything happens, I want people to see this. I would explain to Moxley and everybody else what happened, why I did what I did. What I did was the final lesson. The final lesson is don't always look a step ahead and watch behind your head. He's Blackpool to the day he dies, and that's the final lesson. And I think it worked, man. What do you think?
The ghost of William Regal offering up a lesson from the great beyond.
At first I wasn't like, I'm like, all right, okay. And then he just sold it so good. Like Mr. Regal is amazing, man. He's great.
Well, again, it was fans being rewarded for paying attention because his words paid off the angle that they saw last week. You saw Max blast him from behind. So William Regal, in his own overzealousness, got caught with his pants down. And I think that that's, again, enhancing the heel in MJF, too, for one-upping the ultimate villain with his own rule. And two, it bow ties the Blackpool Combat Club without your traditional heel turn. He's still, in addition to endorsing the heels, he endorsed the baby faces on the way out. That's a good piece of business all the way around as far as I see it, Matt.
I would absolutely agree. The idea that he planned this, the idea that he was leaving, and the idea that he knew something bad could happen to him. He wanted it documented just in case. And I thought that was just great. And that brings an end to the William Regal character. I will say one funny thing is that Jon Moxley reacted like it didn't happen in a way. He just moved on. But my theory is he found himself getting emotional. So he just moved on. He moved on so he didn't dwell on it, because it appeared to me that Jon Moxley was getting emotional. I saw a lot of that online, that Mr. Regal sold it so great that people were like, oh man, beautiful. What a way to end it. Is that the reaction you had?
It was almost like when in a movie an actor dies in real life, and yet they find a way to posthumously have them involved in bookending their character arc.
Right.
It was almost emotional to a degree, especially as we learned some of the real life circumstances behind everything in this Tony Khan press conference today as we record this. It almost added a little extra dramatic context to that. So
you said character on TV. I think you're a young man, younger than me, and I'm not sure if you ever watched a show called MASH.
Of course.
But MASH had a great season 1 or 2 ending where the Colonel was killed, and none of the actors knew it until Radar O'Reilly came in and read it from a piece of paper. And the funny part is McLean Stevenson had moved on to another TV show, and they killed him off so they couldn't bring him back. But the way he read it, and that's the same chill I got from Mr. Regal. I go, oh, it's over, and it's so sad, but I'm so glad it happened.
And it gives you finality too. And that's important.
Closure in wrestling. Dude, what? That's fantastic, right? We never get closure in wrestling.
Never.
And speaking of closure, today Tony Khan brought everybody up to speed, and I think now everybody knows what I knew. So in wrestling, a lot of times you learn things. If you're and with Mr. Regal, dude, he didn't say anything to me ever about anything ever that you didn't hear on the show. Like, I once asked him something as benign as, hey, let me ask you a question, Mr. Regal, and this was off air. And I said, who comes up to you? Who's at those 10 o'clock? Like, what, those 10 o'clock meetings at the mat? Who is always there? Like, who's someone that surprised you? And he's like, I can't really think of anybody. I'm like, all right.
He sold you.
Every time. Another thing about Mr. Regal that was hilarious to me, and I joked about it with my friends, especially like Cassio Kid, who hosts Oh You Didn't Know podcast. He's turned to an awesome podcast host. But I was saying that Mr. Regal never yes-anded me once in my life. Like, if you don't know what that is, folks, that's like if you, if you're doing improv and you go, okay, I'm a little kid walking down the street, and you go, yes, and it's the first day of school, right? Mr. Regal, I would have a point to say, and he'd be saying something, and I'd be like, oh yeah, Mr. Regal's like this, and he'd go, yes. So like I was saying, and I'm like, son of a gun. But my entire point of the podcast was to make it as entertaining as I could for everybody else. But the reality is, it needed to be the podcast he wanted to do. And so I was dedicated to making it the podcast he wanted it to be. And I think we did that.
Can I ask you this? How challenging was it to facilitate as a host when you have a talent that is so multi-layered and multi-dimensioned like William Regal is?
Let me tell you, it was very challenging. It has made me such a better podcast host, though. And it wasn't so much how multi-layered he is. A lot of wrestling people are interesting, right? You work with Eric Bischoff. That's an interesting dude, man. Jeff Jarrett, if you get beneath those layers, he can be a really interesting fella. And Tony Schiavone, really interesting. Like, Tony is very deep. Mr. Regal's that. But the thing about Mr. Regal is he really didn't want to do a podcast the way podcasts are done. He didn't want, if you notice, we never mentioned Meltzer one time on the show. And that was day one. That was like, okay, here's the outline. And he's like, well, we're not doing that. And I go, well, okay then, So on the first episode, I had to change everything I was doing on the fly. And it happened a lot. It happened so much, I just stopped. I never used the research. I looked at it, and then we laughed at it. You
know what I call that, man? I have a term for that in TV, which you can find out about in the Alba Media School, by the way. So there's a great quote from Angus Young of AC/DC fame. He said, anything can go wrong on stage. When all else fails, try tap dancing. And so what I would do in television, if like the teleprompter would go down, or if I needed to stretch or whatever it may be, or if I had to on the fly pivot, I would call it tap dancing. because that's essentially what you're doing in a situation like that. When someone else is dictating against everything that you had planned, you're almost on the fly. Just, okay, what can I do? And as a host, it's horrifying, but it's also the greatest thrill that you can possibly have as an adrenaline rush when that light is on and you're rolling. And I think that was apparent between you guys as you were going through these stories.
I think he eventually got a little maybe respect, at least for the work I was putting in. We didn't talk a lot off screen. He's very polite, very proper, very cordial, all those things. But it wasn't like the relationship I have with, like the relationship I had with Vince Russo, where we talked all the time. We talked all the time when we were doing the show. We got to know each other. It wasn't that. And I think it's two things. One is, that's who Mr. Regal is, man. I'm not a wrestler. I don't belong in that world. He ain't tell me nothing. I got friends like Jon Alba and Sean Ross Sapp and people that I like, and so that are friends. And he probably in the back of his mind is like, he's going to go around to Meltzer and tell him what he's thinking,
sure,
or whatever. And as you know, that's not me. But the other thing is, Mr. Regal is nobody's dummy. Mr. Regal always was looking to be to preserve the Mr. Regal thing as much as he could, because he knew that one day either his contract come at AEW and he did a new contract, or one day he would go to WWE. But he had an agenda, and his agenda was to get his story out. His agenda was to document how he thought wrestling should be. Now, for me to make an entertaining show, it was a little challenging because I had to bring it back around. Wrist locks are great, and I'm fascinated. But I know, I've read the reviews. I know that at a certain time, it's like, all right, let's move on to the next thing. But, dude, Mr. Regal has nonstop goodwill, nonstop knowledge. And if this wasn't going to be a podcast that I could have for the money or the listeners or the downloads, it certainly was one I was going to do to learn from and become a better person from. And Mr. Regal, first and foremost, despite my suspicions about him wanting the efficacy of being, as hireable as he can be for as long as he can, I believe at the very core of it, he is a genuine person who feels very strongly about what he thinks wrestling should be and wanting to get the story out there. And I think we did that.
And there are fans who appreciate that and love that because they live and breathe the performance art in that way. I'll bring an analogy here. One of the greatest thrills of my life was when I was a producer at MLB Network, Major League Baseball. Baseball is my number one passion. Pro wrestling is second for me behind baseball. You see all the 98 Yankees stuff there behind me. And at MLB Network, I was Pedro Martinez's personal producer at points. Now,
he was a little wasn't he kind of a hothead type fella?
On the field, he was.
Yeah, I remember him.
In the TV world, not at all. And he's maybe the greatest pitching mind ever, quite frankly. And I would be in production meetings with him, and we'd be talking about, okay, what's going to be on the show today? And for those of you who are watching this, you'll see this. He would hold up a baseball, and he'd say, like, I want to talk about the difference between releasing a fastball here versus releasing a fastball here.
Like half an inch difference.
Not even half difference. Yeah. And that was for the baseball junkie in me. I'm like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever. So I promise you, there are wrestling fans out there who so deeply appreciate those 45-minute deep dives on the history of a wrist lock. And here's the proper way to apply it. Because when we all feel like we're part of a sport or we're all part of an art, we naturally feel even more connected, and it builds that passion that we have for it as consumers. And we want to be part of that collected, shared experience. And I think that's what a podcast like Gentleman Villain does when you have someone so knowledgeable like that, bestowing all of that information and education on your audience.
And before we talk about the press conference and what the future may hold for Mr. Regal, I'll go ahead and give the announcement as far as the podcast. Mr. Regal is no longer doing the podcast. We have 3 episodes left. This is one of them. Next week, we have something very special because Mr. Regal sent me an email a while ago.
Like an MJF style email, or
dude, one day I'll show you the Jim Cornette email I have. I have a couple of really good emails. But this email was something he made a while ago called the do's and don'ts of professional wrestling. And it's a list. It's a long list of things wrestlers should do and wrestlers shouldn't do. And so maybe with a guest next week, I'm going to talk about that. The following week, we are going to give a little preview into the new podcast. We call it my new podcast. It's not really, but someone much bigger, much more famous, much more big in the wrestling world, much more current person that is going to have a podcast on ad-free shows / podcast heat. And that show is going to be on this feed. So if you subscribe to this show, just hang tight, listen to it, see what you want. It's going to be, and John knows who it is, but we're not saying who it is yet. But John, how different is that podcast going to be from Gentleman Villain?
It's going to be different, but it's going to be with someone who loves pro wrestling in the same way that William Regal does. And I think that for those who just, again, love the performance art of professional wrestling and appreciate the levels of storytelling that go into every single match and every single performance, this is going to be a dream type of podcast for you as a consumer. And it's somebody who I personally have had lengthy conversations with about that. And
he's the best.
I could listen to him talk for hours about it. In just, you feel that passion. And I think your listeners matter in for a real treat.
And I will say,
I'm jealous.
When I first told you about it a while ago, you were just like, oh no. I should have sent the email first. I should have sent the email first.
I had the plan. I was drafting it all up. I'm like, I'm gonna reach out to him and be like, yeah, this is what I want to do. And then and I'm thrilled for you. I'm so happy for you. And in hindsight, I would have had no time for this thing anyway. So I'm thrilled that you will have that opportunity to. Are you going with the name that I gave you?
I think we're going to go with a different name, but I will say this: if you know me, and you heard what John just said, then yes, it's him. That's all I'm going to say. If you heard what John just said about passion, and you know me, then you know who it is. And we're looking forward to that. And that's going to be not next week, but the week after that, a little preview. And then we're going to start right away. I believe it's going to be December 29th with the new podcast, which is going to be blah, blah, blah with blah, blah, blah. And Matt Koon. So let's talk about the press conference today. I heard from Mr. Regal a couple days ago where he said, yeah, I think it's time after what happened last week, because he's Regal. He's like, meaning getting hit in the head by brass knuckles. It's time. And I also heard from other people what we heard today. And what we heard today was a lot of questions. And, I hate being that guy that has to be dumb online. That's like, I don't know what's going on. But I did know a little bit about the 1 year off TV. I did know that he had a contract that Tony Khan let him out early. And Tony Khan said all that stuff. I guess I went over the headlines, but can you talk a little bit more about what was said in the press conference by Mr. Khan today?
Yeah. So Tony basically began the William Regal story by talking about his own personal story where his mother had 2 strokes this fall, which is just horrible. And thankfully, by his indication, she's doing much better. But she was in the Mayo Clinic. She's in the hospital. She had to get this really bad heart surgery that they were hoping would stop the strokes. It was a very vulnerable, transparent thing from Tony Khan, which I really appreciated as a member of wrestling media, because you don't really see a whole lot of that. But he said in the middle of all this chaos, he got a note that William Regal had gone to the powers that be in AEW and requested his release. And Tony wasn't really ready to tackle that just yet, so he kind of rolled with the punches. And if you have an anecdote?
Yeah, well, by the powers that be, everybody thinks Tony Khan is the be-all, end-all, which he is. But Mr. Regal went through the right channels you do in an organization, went to the head of legal or the head of HR, right, and said, here's the deal. And that's Mega, how do you pronounce it?
Mega.
And And then Tony Khan got it, and he didn't have the bandwidth for it at the time, you're saying?
Yes, he was just like, I kind of need to. I'll address it. Let me think it over, all that kind of stuff. And so they had some brief conversations, and then I guess after his mother had one of the surgeries, Regal called him and asked him to step outside. So Tony just like went outside the hospital, sat on a bench, and he said they just talked on the phone. And William said to him, basically, the reason that you're sitting outside right now, that precious family time, that's what I want to make sure that I have with my son. And we know Mr. Regal has had his own health issues in the past, and his son works in WWE, obviously. So Tony said in that moment, it all kind of clicked for him. So that's when he mentally started to make the decision, okay, here's what we can do to move forward. And he said at the Jacksonville tapings they had a couple months ago or last month, I'm not sure exactly when it was, but he said they met for 90 minutes in his office at TIAA Bank Field. And he said that was the longest meeting that they had since Regal came to AEW. And that's where they kind of were able to work it out. And he's like, I realize this is going to create a serious pivot for AEW television, and it's going to be a big hit to my company, but I feel like it's the right human thing to do. And I do think, the internet clowns TK and AEW or whatever it may be, and some criticisms are valid and some aren't. But I think when someone is willing to put humanity ahead of what's best for business, I think that's a really impressive thing that deserves some kudos.
I agree. I own a business too, and I own a business that is completely run by my passion, and I'm not that good at it. Like, I'm not that good at like running a business. I'm good at my core competency, teaching, mentoring kids, music. But when you get that good at something, sometimes it's so good that you have a business with it, you're not that great at it. And it's the kind of decision I would have made. I make decisions like that all the time. And it's, I remember talking to Conrad when I first met him about business. And he goes, because I was talking about how I was angry about something, because I get very passionate about my job. And he goes, Koon, because that's what he calls me. He goes, Koon, do you want to make money or make friends? And I was like, holy crap, that is profound. Like, first conversation I ever had with him, because I was already working on the show, and I go, I need to ask you a business question. I wrote him a long thing. He's like, let's talk. Called me, and that was the first sentence out of his mouth, and that's all I needed. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to focus on making money for a couple years, and it worked.
Scott Hall famously said it's not show friends, it's show business.
Right, and honestly, it wasn't for me. I like the way my business is now, and I don't have, and I ruffle a few feathers, and I'm a little disorganized, and I make a few mistakes based on my heart, but I'm okay with that. But Mr. Khan, this beautiful thing he did, which I believe is a Regal only thing.
Yes. And Tony said that. He's like, well, I can't reunite families, generally speaking, but I'll make the exception.
Right, because you've got Zelina and you've got Malachi, who was rumored to ask for his release. You've got Andrade and Charlotte, who was definitely rumored to ask for his release. And this is a Regal thing only, but I'm just going, is this a good business move? I am all for Mr. Regal going back to WWE and having his role and working with his son. But from an AEW watcher standpoint, which I've been since before the beginning, since before All In, and we were at StarCast, we were all involved with everything, and it seems a little, I don't know, but for you as a journalist, as a someone who comments on wrestling today, what do you think of that business decision to do that for Mr. Regal?
I think objectively, just about every segment William Regal was in was some of the more compelling parts of AEW TV. So yeah, it leaves a hole in that regard. I think you could turn it around and say, well, with the focus being gone on that might allow some other guys to get some TV time, which is always a good thing. And that's certainly a problem that AEW has had, where your roster is so big that people are struggling for TV time.
Well, Jericho's really struggling to get some time, so hopefully he can get a little bit more time on TV. That's a joke. All right, go ahead, John. I'm sorry. Oh, John's you're a silent laugher, John.
I just have to watch what I say, but that was good.
Yes.
That was good. But yeah, so I do think that there is an element of truth to that. Was William Regal this gigantic draw that was printing money out of the ass for AEW? I don't necessarily think so, but as I said, compelling TV is compelling TV, and I think it's undeniable that anything MJF is in and anything William Regal was in is, generally speaking, pretty compelling television. So it does hurt in that regard. But again, I think if you are truly trying to make a change in pro wrestling, which I believe was ultimately how AEW came about, we're trying to make a change in pro wrestling.
Absolutely.
Cody called it the revolution, right? If you are trying to make that statement, then when circumstances like this arise, you do need to make those types of decisions every now and then. And again, circling back, because I, much like pro wrestling, love full circle storytelling, I think it speaks to how much respect that Tony Khan has for William Regal. Lord Regal, pardon me.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks volumes.
And also, like, it does feed into this notion, fair or not, that their inmates are running the asylum sometimes at AEW. But I will say it also feeds in this other notion, which to me is much more important. I've never heard one person, a solitary human being, and I know a lot of people, as you do, say Tony Khan's a bad guy. Tony Khan's a piece of crap. Tony Khan's like, I've never heard that. I've heard, other stuff like I was saying before, but it just, to me, I was just like, when I saw it, I was like, dude, that's kind of beautiful, and that's kind of the way the world should be. Like, from a business standpoint, I'm sure someone like Conrad, who's very business oriented, would be like, but for me, I just thought it was a beautiful thing to do for somebody he respected. And I think if that's the legacy of AEW, that ain't too bad.
Not at all. Not at all. And it has given people a safer place to work when it comes to stuff like that. So I think they do deserve it. And look, we're going to get tweets and DMs. You're just kissing ass, blah, blah, blah. I've got no vested interest here. Yeah, I do a podcast with an AEW talent, but I've been openly critical. I've been complimentary. It's just the nature of the beast, right? So I do think that it is worth objectively saying that this was a good human nature thing to do.
And again, people say, oh, you kiss ass or whatever. Let me tell you something about Tony Khan. Tony Khan replaced my song. He's like, your song sucks. This is going to be better. Mikey Ruckus, can you get something that I don't hate as much? And then he did it. And it was a good business decision for him. It sucked for me on an ego level, probably more than a financial level, but both. So I have no reason to say anything to protect Tony Khan or anything like that. I don't work for him, and obviously never will. Because I mean, he hated my music, but
that's all right. Either, so you're good.
Oh well, dude, it is what it is. But at the same time, it was a beautiful thing to do, and I think not enough is made of the fact that too much is made of like, oh, I don't like this wrestling, and not enough is made of, man, there's been a lot of pieces of crap to run wrestling companies over the last ever, and he's not one of them. And that's a cool thing.
I want to ask you this question because I'm curious from your perspective. This was something that my tweets were flooded with this past week. Did AEW utilize William Regal correctly on television?
I think, okay, so, man, I don't want to be like Mr. Regal. Like last show we did, I said, hey, what do you think of this notion of matchups versus compelling matchups, where we have matchups and then we have matchups where we want someone to win? And he just like laid silently for 10 seconds and goes, I'll just leave that there, So I'm sorry, I lost my place. What was the question again, John? I lost my mind for a second.
Do you think AEW utilized
there we go. Cool. Yeah.
The proper role on television?
So, I don't want to be like Mr. Regal and not answer that question. But I'm going to answer that question, and I'm putting it off for a while.
While you think about it, I'll just say this. I think they did. Okay. I think he was utilized in an efficient role that did not take away from anybody.
I think because of Tony Khan's positive personal traits that we've talked about before, there's a lot of wrestlers there's a lot of dudes on AEW. There's there's too many, in my opinion, to make, to create that kind of hierarchy you need of a guy you can't beat, a guy you can beat sometimes, a guy's on up and coming. It seems sometimes like a lot of people are on the same level. That being said, Mr. Regal was used better than most, and he was relied on a lot. He was relied on in so many different ways, and everything, it speaks a lot to Mr. Regal because everything that he did, he nailed. Every single thing he did, he nailed. I asked him once, why aren't you at the commentary table during that Moxley match? And he goes, not enough chairs. Like he would have been there if they could have let him there. So I think if you look at, let's compare to the XWE guys. Better than all of them, probably, right? Better than all of them. I think could have been used better, perhaps, but that's me sitting here in my house in Virginia, not in Jacksonville, with 100 people banging down my door saying, put me on TV.
Here's why I think it was successful. He successfully added dimension and layers to, in particular, 2, but you could even argue 3, established names in pro wrestling. He brought out a side of Jon Moxley and Bryan Danielson in AEW that we haven't seen yet. A more physical side. A side that is simultaneously full of emotion and devoid of emotion. And added a new element to baby faces working together that I don't think we've really explored on television before. And you can include Claudio into that if you'd like to as well. So for that reason alone, I feel it was an effective run. And like I said, objectively, just about every segment that they were in is compelling in some degree.
I agree. I think, though, I guess I just want to be true to myself and say what I say off air, on air. But I also don't want to be, sound stupid. I think, in some sense, it defined them down a little bit, Moxley and Danielson. Because you lump them together as opposed to these two giants. Now you had a faction that wasn't really presented like a giant all the time. They weren't treated like the Four Horsemen where they're rolling over everybody, right? And when you have Moxley and Danielson, who are the two, the number one person in the company and the guy who at any time could be the number one in any company, in Bryan Danielson, I felt like maybe it was like the sum was a little bit less than the whole of its parts as far as the Blackpool Combat Club. As far as Mr. Regal, I think he did a great job. And I think they all did a great job in that role. But I'm not so sure about putting the entire babyface side, I hate using words like that, the entire good guy side under one umbrella and then not have them be this total dominating force.
But also you need ways to keep characters busy in the periphery when they're not necessarily in the title picture. And when you can do that in a way that is different than what is traditionally presented, which is what I do believe the Blackpool Combat Club was, I do think that lends itself to reflection and saying, yeah, that was something that I'm not sure I'd really seen done like that before. And I haven't seen Bryan Danielson be that intense dragon in years. And Jon Moxley developed this subtle little layer to him that maybe he didn't have prior. I look back at this as a very successful TV run, truth be told. And there is the part of it that we were discussing before, and you said where, maybe guys didn't have as much TV time because they're ceding way to something like this. But look, now at the end of the day, you can make all the arguments you want. A guy like Wheeler Yuta is in a better position than he was prior.
No doubt.
And there are some other guys who will benefit from that down the line too.
And it is, again, I don't know how you do it if you're Tony Khan. I don't know how you look at a Takeshita and don't sign him. I don't know how you look at an AR Fox and don't sign him. I don't know how you do that. But at the same time, when you have that many people, I think the Blackpool Combat Club was also part of that thing where let's get 5 of the guys on TV at the same time. Let's make sure to get them in. Let's get them on. They're in a group together. Jericho Appreciation Society, Inner Circle, Pinnacle, Elite, those kind of things. Get them all together. And I don't think anybody was hurt by it. And I think Wheeler Yuta was helped by it. I think Claudio was helped by it. Mm-hmm. And I think Jon Moxley and Daniel Bryan, like you said, it added some layers to their characters. And they're both ready to be number ones if you want to be number ones. But right now, that son of a bitch, MJF is number one. And that's just the way it's going to be, I guess, for a while, unless Ricky Starks puts us all out of our misery.
And now Bryan Danielson has another added reason to want that championship. It's not just about winning the championship. It's about avenging his fallen friend. And that's a great, sometimes one of the criticisms of AEW is, why are these guys fighting? What's the point here? Well, now we have that added element where I understand Bryan Danielson's path, should that be a match down the line, which truthfully I do think, barring any injuries, is probably going to be.
Oh, that's where they got to go. I mean, yes. Right?
So,
and you bring up a good point. Like with Bryan Danielson, we had the Yes movement. Man, what a blown opportunity that was, I think, for WWE, and because I was there, I was at WrestleMania 30, it was a special thing that they didn't get as much out of as they could have because they turned him to the Wyatt family. I was there when he joined the Wyatt family. He was in Richmond, and it was like, what in the hell? But this layer of him, when he comes to the, AEW, Bryan Danielson's layer is, I'm the best Rush in the world. I'm more vicious than you think. I'm the American Dragon. But now he has vengeance. Mr. Regal gave him that as his last gift. He gave him this added level of vengeance, and Lord have mercy on Maxwell Jacob Friedman's soul for that, huh?
And that's a very human emotion. We've all felt that in some way, at a small level, or perhaps in a case like this, at a very high level. That creates a compelling story to tell that people will want to see be paid off. So that's a great gift for not just the performer, but for the fans as well. You're also muted right now, just so you know.
I wasn't supposed to produce.
AlbaMediaSchool.com.
I wasn't I was the producer of an Emmy Award winning, Sports Illustrated Podcast of the Year.
That's right.
And then I just decided I don't do that anymore, and I'm really terrible at it now. So my apologies. So let me say the sentence that I said that nobody heard. How about that? So now this brings us to the future. We found out that it was a 1-year contract that had an option for a re-signing, which is a lot of the contracts at AEW have 2 years, 1 year, 3 years with an option to re-sign. But he was let out of it early because of the conversation he talked about. Mr. Regal
will be let out. He has not been let out yet as we tape this.
But it should be through the end of December, or
he said through the holiday season.
Right. And then the deal is, as we found out today, that he can't be on TV for a year. I think Mr. Regal's fine with that. Mr. Regal was good with being a talent. He talked about that on the show. He liked being a talent. His job was not coming in at 10 o'clock every morning and training people. That was not part of his job description. That was something he liked to do, that he wanted to do. And I have a feeling that he yearned to do more stuff like that. So I guess my question is, Triple H is not the head of NXT anymore. Triple H is sitting on the throne. So is Mr. Regal the hand of the king now? Or is he going to be NXT?
I think it would be wise to utilize him in a multitude of roles, almost like a talent development overseer, if you will, between NXT and the main roster. I think he would be extremely valuable in that. But I will say this, Matt, after seeing how effective and compelling, that's the word I keep using, but compelling William Regal was on television, it makes me yearn to see him once again on television for WWE at some point, maybe after that year is up. Because it's clear he has a lot to offer still in an on-air role. I always enjoyed his on-air work prior to his AEW run, but this AEW run showed he can be used in a different way than how we've seen him used in the past, and I think they would be wise to. I'll also throw out this possibility. NXT Europe is about to become a thing in the next year. Let's see how they maybe utilize him for their expansion projects with NXT as well.
I would guess, he didn't complain a lot about travel, but I'm just guessing that travel is a factor, and that, him being down in Orlando and not traveling a whole bunch. I don't think he desires to be on the plane, quote unquote, the plane, unquote. I don't know but it's 2022. Triple H is not Vince. I don't think he needs you in the room. I think he's very capable of FaceTiming and capable of Zooming, and we're using StreamYard right now. And, I think Mr. Regal will probably have a bigger role. I think Triple H is lucky to have him. And I think, to your point, on-air talent, I'm not sure how interested Mr. Regal is in that. He might be, but I never got that from him that that's what he wanted to do now, because he got so excited about teaching. He got so excited about developing talent. He got such a glint in his eye when he talked about the Baileys of the world, you know?
He
it was a different thing.
Really well as NXT commissioner. It was that perfect split of on-air talent and actually overseeing things. If he returned in a role similar to that, I'd be plenty happy with that.
Well, as Mr. Regal would say, I'll just do my job. I'll just do my job.
He's good at it.
You know, I remember we were talking earlier about how he was to podcast with. And I remember the first episode when I gave this huge setup and I go, you're at home. You see Jon Moxley, the man you had this feud with 15 years ago, get on Double or Nothing and walk through the crowd. I was there. And the crowd responded to him. And what were your thoughts seeing this guy that you kind of discovered making this kind of entrance? And he goes, good for him. I'm like, shit, I gotta figure this out.
Well, you did a great job, and it really was an entertaining show for purists of professional wrestling. And it was a gift. It was a gift that we got, because like you said, so many talent have had the opportunity to sit under this tree if they wanted the chance to. But listeners at home, people like me, I never got that chance. So a podcast like this afforded that, even if it was just for a few months ultimately.
And I made some promises to Mr. Regal. One is, you know, with the YouTube, we're going to organize a lot of the clips to be like a wrestling school. And another thing is we're going to make a long form history of Mr. Regal, the life of a wrestler. So you can look on the YouTube, the Gentleman Villain YouTube, for that coming up. Of course, next week, we got the do's and don'ts of professional wrestling by Mr. Regal. Of course, he won't be here, but his words will. And hopefully I'll have a wrestler or a journalist in the room to kind of bounce some of that stuff off of. The following week, we'll have a little preview of the new podcast, like I said, blah, 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 with blah, blah, blah. And then we're off and running on the same feed you're on right now. The same feed. Just listen to the first couple shows. Let us know what you think. Jon Alba, can't thank you enough for joining us. Of course, The Extreme Life of Matt Hardy, probably the most underrated wrestling podcast in all of wrestling. Matt Hardy gets it as far as who he is. He gets the self-awareness. He also gets how to make a good podcast. I would say there's nobody in his level right now as a star/podcaster except maybe Mick Foley. I think he's at that level. Talk a little bit about that show for people who haven't heard it yet.
I appreciate that immensely. It's available every single Friday, wherever you get your podcasts, or at extremehardy.com. I believe that there is not a more educational podcast about pro wrestling in a very different way than what Gentleman Villain was, where that was more the intricacies, X's and O's of pro wrestling. Matt educates audiences about storytelling and creative and character building in a way that I don't think, truthfully, anybody else in the game does. And you may on the surface level say, well, it's Matt Hardy. You know, like, he wasn't even the star of the Hardy Boys. Jeff Hardy was the rock star.
Yeah.
I always thought that Matt Hardy was the secret sauce of the Hardy Boys.
But we've learned in wrestling podcasts, that's not necessarily important.
No.
Who in the hell thought Bruce Pritchard would have the best podcast of all time? I remember Conrad pitched it to all his friends. All his friends are like, what? Bruce Pritchard after Ric Flair? But bro, like, and Matt Hardy is on that level. He's that good. He's also got a self-awareness and a good contextualization of his career and his place in the career. You also have the misfortune of co-hosting with Eric Bischoff on Strictly Business, which is a sister podcast to 83 Weeks, but it's now on the main feed. I will ask you this. Maybe you can ask Bischoff this. Hypothetically, if you're at a Brazilian steakhouse, right? How good is it for business for somebody who's waiting for a table to sneak to the salad bar and just start eating stuff off the salad bar? Because that is what I saw Eric Bischoff do in Huntsville, Alabama once.
That's some variation of Strictly Business there. I'll tell you that.
In fairness, he was hungry, but still. He just walked over like a stud. He's like, I'm eating this stuff right out of the bar.
He's Eric Bischoff, man. And that show drops every Thursday. That is a show about the business of the business. And I think that's pretty cool when all's said and done. We, a couple weeks ago, did an episode about wrestling conventions and the business of wrestling conventions. This past week, we did an episode with a Grammy Award winning and 9-time nominated producer and talked about the effect that music has in pro.
Who's that?
Isaac, I want to make sure I pronounce his name correctly here. It is, as it put me on the spot here, I apologize.
Isaac oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. What were you
I was going to say Isaac, the record producer, got a bunch
Isaac
of Grammys.
Riston. Isaac Riston, and he was incredible. It was an outstanding conversation. So go check that out wherever you get the 83 Weeks podcast and 83weeks.com. It drops right on that feed. It's a really different kind of pro wrestling podcast. I'm very proud of these two shows, and I appreciate you letting me plug them, and I hope you get a chance to check them out alongside my Patreon, WrestlingAccordingToAlba.com, and my media school, AlbaMediaSchool.com.
Absolutely. Make sure to check those out. And guys, come back next week because we got the do's and don'ts professional wrestling, and the following week for the last episode of Gentleman Villain, where we're going to give a preview for the new podcast. John, I can't thank you enough. I had a great time. I hope you had a great time. I hope the listeners enjoy it. Make sure you give us some feedback at, what is our Twitter? Gentleman Regal. Jon Alba, you're on Twitter at Jon Alba, right?
JONALBA, lose the H. H's are for losers.
Yeah, there's a at Matt Koon out there that hasn't tweeted in 15 years, and I secretly want him to die, Jon Alba. I really do. Anyway, guys.
I appreciate you having me on. This was such a blast, and congratulations to you on a great run with William Regal, and I'm very excited for everyone to find out what's next for you.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us, guys. We will see you next time on Gentleman Villain without William Regal.